Have you ever heard the old military adage that on paper, every plan is perfect until the first shot is fired? Well, what we are witnessing today in the Russian invasion goes far beyond a planning failure. It is a dangerous shadow theater that begins in Vladimir Putin's office and ends in a humanitarian and strategic disaster on Ukrainian soil. For the audience that follows this channel and understands that war is made of logistics, morale, and truth, the signs of collapse of the Russian army are becoming impossible to ignore. While Moscow's official channels try to paint a picture of heroic advances, the technical reality shows us that Putin's army is entering a process of degradation faster than any Western analyst predicted at the beginning of this year. But how does this work in practice? This is where the bonus scam comes in. Russian generals, pressured by results they cannot deliver, have created a perverse dynamic. They infiltrate small groups of soldiers, often men without proper training, through Ukrainian lines, just so they can reach an abandoned village or a ruined building. There, they raise a Russian flag, take a geolocated photo, and retreat, or, most often than not, are eliminated minutes later. The goal of this suicide mission: to send the photo to the high command in Moscow, prove a non-existent conquest, and secure financial bonuses and medals of bravery. It is a war of likes and fake reports, while the real army bleeds in a stalemate that we haven't seen for over a century. The proof that desperation has taken hold of the Kremlin is in the numbers. The current Russian advance is the slowest recorded in more than 100 years of modern military history. If we compare it with the great maneuvers of the Second World War, what we see today is a strategic paralysis. Vladimir Putin tells his people that everything is under control, but the reality is that Ukraine has already destroyed about $4 billion in Russian air defense systems, leaving the armored giant completely blind and vulnerable. Why, even with the threat of a massive offensive of 100,000 soldiers for the spring, is the mood among experts one of skepticism about Russian capacity? Today, we are going to dissect the exposed battle plans and understand how Ukraine transformed the Donbas into a deadly labyrinth, a true $2 billion technological meat grinder that is about to swallow the last hopes of a quick victory for Moscow. Prepare yourself, because what you are going to see now is the anatomy of an army that has stopped in time, trying to fight a 21st century war with exhaustion tactics that are leading Russia to the limit of its human and economic stock. To understand why Russia is in a critical situation, we need to look up. In the last year, Ukraine performed a feat that many experts in Washington and London considered impossible. It destroyed about $4 billion in state-of-the-art Russian air defense systems. For those who understand military strategy, this is not just an accounting loss. It is what we call the suppression of enemy defenses. The Alpha Unit, an elite special operations task force, was the spearhead of this mission, disabling radars, command centers, and short and long-range missile batteries in vital points such as Crimea and the Donbas. The result? The Russian command lost the ability to see what comes from behind the lines. Imagine an armored giant trying to fight in a dark room. That is how Putin's forces find themselves today. With the sky clear of enemy radars, long-range Ukrainian drones now penetrate the Russian rear with humiliating ease, hitting ammunition depots and logistical centers that were previously considered unreachable. But the most severe impact occurs on the front line. Without the coverage of these air defenses, Ukraine's MiG-29 fighters have gained a new life. They now operate with what we describe as local air superiority, providing direct support to ground troops and launching devastating precision bombs. Meanwhile, Russian logistics collapse. We have seen units being forced to use civilian vehicles and even horses for transport, trying to hide among the population to avoid being detected. It is a clear demonstration that Russia's cutting-edge technology has failed, and now the army that claimed to be the second largest in the world depends on guerrilla tactics and improvisation to avoid being completely swept off the tactical map. When technology fails and logistics collapse, what remains is desperate improvisation. What we are seeing on the front now is almost surreal for the standards of a military power. Russian tanks equipped with nets of loose wires and handcrafted metal structures. The objective? To try, unsuccessfully, to stop the Ukrainian FPV drones, which have become the greatest nightmare of the armored columns. This scrap armor is the greatest symbol of Russian desperation. They know that their sophisticated electronic systems are not working against the agility of Ukraine's drones. Meanwhile, mobility on the battlefield has reached a critical level. Without enough armored vehicles for everyone, the Russians have started using snowmobiles and civilian quad bikes to infiltrate small teams. But the problem is not just the lack of metal, it is the lack of will. Recent reports show that, upon encountering any resistance or technical difficulty, surrender has become the first option for many Russian soldiers. In sectors like Zaporizhia, entire captured units confess that they prefer the status of prisoners of war to certain death by orders of commanders who see them only as numbers. Discipline is hanging by a thread. When the troops realize they are being used as cannon fodder on snowmobiles against prepared defenses, morale collapses. Putin's army is not just losing tanks, it is losing the man who should operate them. While Russia tries to sell the idea of an overwhelming offensive for the coming months, Ukraine silently erected what analysts call the Iron Belt. Forget the improvised trenches from the beginning of the conflict. We are talking about an investment of $2 billion in a defensive network that extends for hundreds of kilometers in the Donbas and in Zaporizhia. It is a deep system, designed not only to stop the enemy, but to annihilate them methodically. Imagine a deadly labyrinth composed of gigantic anti-tank ditches, thousands of concrete dragon's teeth, and minefields so dense that they transform every square meter into a lottery against death. Behind this, there are deep bunkers and trenches, totally hidden from the view of Russian drones, where the Ukrainian infantry awaits the right moment. The strategy here is simple, yet cruel. The planned delay. The barriers force the Russian armor to reduce speed or stop. At that exact moment, they leave the movement zone and enter the kill zone. Without air cover, which, as we saw, was destroyed, and trapped in physical obstacles, the Russian columns become easy targets for precision artillery and FPV drones. British intelligence estimates that, to break this line specifically in Donetsk, Putin would need 4 more years and 2 million casualties. That is why we call this defense a meat grinder. Ukraine traded the attempt at dramatic advances for the construction of a fortress that bleeds the Russian army at every attempt at progress. But there is a factor that weighs more than steel on the battlefield: time. Vladimir Putin is racing against a clock he does not control. With Donald Trump establishing June as a horizon to force a peace agreement, the Kremlin has entered a state of urgency. Putin desperately needs territorial victories to have something to offer at the negotiating table. But Russia's economic reality tells a different story. More than $50 billion were drained from public coffers to sustain this invasion, and the Russian deficit already exceeds $73 billion. How does this affect the common citizen and the morale of the country? Just look at the shelves. The price of basic items such as cucumbers rose 425% in 1 week. The so-called shadow fleet of Russian oil tankers is being seized around the world, cutting off the last source of financial oxygen for the regime. Putin is playing his last cards, trying to maintain a posture of strength while his economic rear rots. Zelensky, on the other hand, knows that time is his ally. While Russia bombards cities like Kyiv and Odessa to simulate control, Ukraine stands firm in its defensive lines. They know that Putin wants territories on paper because he cannot conquer them on the ground. The impasse is clear. Russia does not have the financial capacity to sustain a high-intensity war for another 4 years, and Ukraine does not intend to yield a millimeter of what its iron belt already protects. The scenario that is emerging for the middle of this year is not one of a Russian victory, but of an exhausted regime trying to avoid total collapse in the face of a world that has closed its doors to its economy. What we see today in Zaporizhia and in the Donbas is no longer a war of rapid movements, but a brutal test of endurance where Ukraine managed to blind the Russian giant. Vladimir Putin is playing his last chips in a spring offensive that will find an obstacle he simply cannot ignore. A defense that costs too much to be broken, and an internal economy that can no longer hide the scars. With international negotiations in Geneva and Abu Dhabi at an impasse over who yields what, the battlefield remains the only place where the truth cannot be made up by financial bonuses or propaganda. But the crucial question that remains for the coming days is this: to what extent will Russia's internal structure endure maintaining this war machine before economic collapse forces a withdrawal that Ukrainian weapons are already drawing on the ground? I want to know your honest opinion, based on what we analyzed today. Do you believe that the Iron Belt will be the final point of Putin's ambitions? Or is there still some card up the Kremlin's sleeve that we haven't seen? Comment down below as your analysis helps to build our community of serious debate about this war. If you value direct information, without sensationalism and focused on strategic reality, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. In the next video, we are going to analyze a suspicious troop movement that has just been detected via satellite on the border with Belarus, something that could change everything we discussed today. Thank you for your trust, a big hug, and until the next analysis.